At this point, we've created some nice flipped fluid simulations for both the wide shot river and this close-up here, but we still need to add the whitewater layer. This whitewater layer is very important to adding all of this extra detail and realism to the shot. And for the flipped liquid, for that main body of water, we started with the wide shot here, so that we could then chop a section out of that and upres and finesse it. But for the whitewater, we're going to do the exact opposite. In this wide shot here, the whitewater is an important component of that shot, but we don't see it very closely, and we don't have to obsess quite as much over what the whitewater looks in the wide shot as compared to the close-up shot. In this close-up shot, we're really seeing this whitewater layer in much more detail, and we really need to finesse that look and get it right when we see it so clearly. So I'm going to first focus on this, and then after creating a nice whitewater look for this close-up shot, then we can copy that over to the wide shot and run it there. So to build this setup, let's first create a geometry object for it. I'll call this whitewater close-up and turn off the display flag on that, and dive inside here and create an object merge to import that close-up simulation. This is going to be the actual cached out sim and not just the render mesh. And typically I always point my object merges to a null. So I'll put my scene update on manual just so it doesn't cook anything when we go to that river close-up setup. So diving inside there, we have our cached out river sim here, and just for convenience I'll add a null after that and call this out river sim. Of course you can just point your object merge to this file cache directly if you prefer, that's up to you. And now going back to our whitewater setup, I'll point that object merge to object/river closeup and out river sim, and turn our scene updating back on to auto update. And we can also go back to our simulation scale static camera. And we are ultimately going to need to reference the simulation into the DOPNet setup for the whitewater. So let's add a null after this as well. I'll call this sim river. And now we can start building our whitewater source from this. So drop in a whitewater source, connect our simulation to that. And this has lots of options for how that whitewater source will be created. So let's start by just displaying that whitewater source in its default state. So we are getting some whitewater emission right away, and you can see that the output of this SOP is a volume called emit, and this is what we're going to pass to the solver so this knows where to emit some whitewater particles. Ultimately, the whitewater solver is just going to be a particle simulation, but we are using this volume to define those emission areas. So on this first tab for emission, we have options to limit the depth range where whitewater can be emitted. Right now it can be a depth of -1 through 0. For my end result, I shrank that range a little bit to -0.3 and 0.2 above the surface. The maximum half width thing is just a performance optimization that we can leave alone. And the speed range is going to be quite important. So this speed range is kind of a rule that applies to all of the sourcing on this entire whitewater source SOP. So on these other tabs, we have controls to emit based on curvature, acceleration, vorticity, some extra inputs, but all of this will be overruled by the speed range here. So if I set this to some really ridiculously high value, then you can see that regardless of the fact that we have some settings to emit based on curvature, acceleration, and vorticity, we aren't getting any whitewater emission at all, because none of our simulation areas are in this speed range from 200 to 400. So I'll control middle click the speed range to set that back to default, and I'm going to leave this alone for now, though we may come back to that later. And before we look at these other specific types of emission, let's go over to the Volumes tab. And this Output Volumes option here is really just for extra fields. If we enable this, this will also output the liquid's SDF and velocity, but we really don't need those. You can see that even without this option selected, we are getting this emit volume as our output. For the voxel size here, I'm just going to set this to be the same as our simulation input. You can see our cached out simulation has a voxel size of 0.04, so I'll just use the same thing here. And most of this stuff we don't really need to worry about right now, but we can enable some masking here. So currently, we are getting some emission beyond the edges of our camera frame, and that's not necessarily problematic, but we can potentially optimize things a bit by limiting that. Anytime we're running high-res sims, it's always good to add in as much optimization as possible, so you're not really wasting computer resources on the areas you don't see. So let's create a mask volume to turn off our whitewater emission in some areas. So I'll drop in a volume SOP, and on the From Camera tab, let's point this to our static SimSpace version of the camera. Set the initial value to 1, the Z far to 50, and let's display that camera volume, which is currently super low res, so I'll turn up the uniform sampling divisions to 100, and control template display our simulation input for the river. So you can see here how much of this river input is outside of our camera view. And in this case, we're not really wasting very much. There's not a massive portion of our river that's out of the camera here. So I suppose this extra bit of optimization is an optional step, but just to show you how this mask input on the whitewater works, I'm going to go ahead and construct this mask volume from that camera. Now let's display this whitewater source and turn on the mask here. I'll set that mask name to density, and then let's connect this camera volume to the emission mask and set the name to density. But I found that this doesn't work when it's connected directly like this. So instead of using this camera volume directly like that, let's convert this to a VDB. So I'll display that volume and drop in a convert volume SOP. This will convert it to a polygonal representation, and then we can use VDB from polygons to create a VDB from that. Let's display that and increase the voxel size a bit because this doesn't need to be very high res. And I'll turn off the SDF option and enable the fog VDB, which is named density by default. And I'll add a null underneath this just to keep things labeled nicely. I'll call that camera mask. And now let's display that whitewater source. So now you can see that this is being clipped correctly to that camera mask input. If we display the convert volume polygon representation of that camera frustum, you can see this perfectly matches the clipped off area of that whitewater source. However, typically we don't want to trim our effects right at the very edges of the camera frame. Usually we want things to be trimmed a bit wider than that, so we have some safe buffer area in between. So we can adjust the frustum on that volume SOP. Let's go to the window X and Y settings. For the Y region, I'm going to expand this quite a bit so that we don't clip anything off vertically. I'll set the Y from -0.5 to 1.5. And for the X axis, we can expand it a bit more on the side that the water's flowing into, and only expand it a little bit in the area the water's flowing out of. Because in the area that the water's flowing out, we don't really need to worry about making sure the input is looking nice on that side of the camera. So for the window X minimum value, I'll just set this to -0.05 for a little bit of expansion. And for the max value, I'll set this to 1.2. So now let's turn off that camera volume display. And if we flip this mask on and off, you can see we're not trimming off a ton of our whitewater source here, but we are trimming it a bit. So this looks pretty good, and we can move on to dialing in the actual sourcing. Now ultimately, the whitewater solver is going to use this emit volume to determine where to source the particles, but we can turn on some additional particle display on the source here to help us dial things in. So under visualization, let's turn on source particles. And you can see these particles are colored based on the type of sourcing that's generated them. So if they're sourced based on curvature, they'll be red. Based on acceleration, they'll be green. Vorticity will be blue. And right now, this is a pretty sparse set of points. We can increase the particle density here by lowering the whitewater scale. I'll try setting that to 0.03. So now we have much more particle density here. So now let's go through each of these different sourcing types. So for now, let's turn off emit from vorticity and turn off acceleration and just look at curvature first. And curvature will source some whitewater based on the curvature of the actual fluid surface. So if you had an ocean surface with a bunch of wave peaks that you wanted to emit some whitewater on, then the curvature could be quite helpful for that. But for this river shot, I don't feel like it's really necessary, so I'm just going to turn off emit from curvature. And let's turn on emit from acceleration. So this will source whitewater within this acceleration range defined here. And of course, we need to play around with these ranges a bit. And to make it a bit easier, I often like to just copy the minimum parameter and paste the relative reference into the max, and then just add an offset to the max. So I'll say 20 plus the minimum. So this allows us to just change one value to move the entire range around instead of needing to change both the min and the max manually. So let's try turning up this acceleration range. That's looking a bit better. Ultimately, as we dial in this whitewater sourcing, we want some pretty tight little patches of sourcing. We don't want just a big cloud of sourcing existing everywhere. We just want this tight, defined, patchy look. So turning up the acceleration to 50 is a bit better. Let's try even higher. 60 looks pretty good. Push that even more. So an acceleration range from 90 to 110 is looking quite nice. This gives us a nice patchy, detailed whitewater source here. So I'm happy with this for our initial sim. And then I'll turn off the acceleration to take a look at vorticity. So turning on vorticity, we're getting tons of sourcing everywhere. So once again, we need to really dial this in quite a bit for a more defined and patchy source. And as before, I'll copy the minimum parameter, paste a relative reference into the max, and add an offset. Try 20. And once again, let's try turning up this vorticity range to tighten up that source. So 60 is looking a lot better. 80 is looking pretty tight and defined, but I'm going to try expanding this range a bit more. So instead of adding 20, let's try adding 40. And increasing that range didn't change this very much, but overall I'm happy with how this looks, so we can combine this with our acceleration. And as you tweak these sources, you may find yourself needing to change the speed range that's eligible for sourcing. So we can try turning down the speed range a little bit. That didn't change things very much, but overall I'm happy with how the sourcing looks so far, so I'm going to stick with this. And we haven't looked at adding extra sources yet via the second input on the whitewater source, but we'll save that for a little bit later after we do our initial sim. So for now, let's just label this whitewater source with a null. Dropping in that null, I'll call this source whitewater. And then we can move on to setting up the actual simulation for this.